Welcome to Coaches on Zoom Getting Coffee. Each episode features a candid, unfiltered, and unedited conversation between two coaches. Hosted by Daniel Kimball, CEO of Resonance Executive Coaching.
Well, hi, Corey. Glad to have you on the show today. You're Corey Stanford. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Corey Stanford, and I'm a leadership and executive coach in Colorado Springs, Colorado.
Great. Thanks for joining me today. Happy to have you. The first thing I want to start with is what's top of mind? What's top of heart for you right now?
Well, I've really been thinking about how to best support not only leaders, but everybody through what's going on with COVID-19. And it's interesting because it's really turned me towards focusing a lot less on the typical topics of, would say like interpersonal skills, working with others, and
Yeah.
more towards sort of the mindset of a leader or just anybody who needs to sort of manage through uncertainty. And so that's where a lot of my focus has been recently.
Say more about that shift. What's changing for you more specifically as far as what you're focusing on?
Well, there are certain skills that are involved with really examining your own perspective, with being able to step back from all of the noise and get that clarity within yourself without needing to, make sense of everything that's all around. So for me, when I talk about intrapersonal skills, a lot of it is about not only calming the mind, but being self-directed and being continuously aware, having emotional awareness of what am I experiencing right now,
Yeah.
and being okay with it and not pushing it aside to run towards productivity or driving for results.
Yeah. So really focusing, I would call it the inner game of leadership. Like how do we respond and create from our situation versus being kind of run by the situation? Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
And I think it's even more important right now for us, whatever our role might be, whether it's leadership or within our family life, with our friends, whatever we're faced with, to focus on how can we respond in the best way possible and take in everything. But I would say there's more noise right now than ever in many ways. At the same time, we can't afford to tune it out. We have to let stuff in and understand what's going on and make sense of it and internalize it. And as you said, not run away from anything we might be feeling around it, but allow ourselves to feel it. And if we try to push it away, it'll just come back that much stronger.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and there's a lot of noise, and so I think there's a balance between sort of staying tuned into what's happening in the world around us, what's happening with other people, and what's happening with myself, and
Yeah.
what are the habits that maybe aren't serving me, such as checking, the social media news feed every hour and things like that, that just create sort of more distraction and uncertainty and disruption and confusion.
Yeah. And I think that discipline, if you will, of, being conscious of how we spend our time and energy is even more important right now. I find myself sometimes getting, as you were just saying, overly wrapped up in the latest news. And I can just, if I get a free moment, I can go jump on, I'll just check really quick is what I tell myself. I'll check really quick what's going on. Next thing I know, I spent 20 minutes or whatever looking at news that maybe there's some new information, but generally speaking, if you check in once or twice a day, that's enough to know what's going on. And it's I found it to be too easy to get seduced by the news and get pulled in by stuff that's not necessarily worth my focus at that point in time.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the news cycle is just full of subjective information, people's best guesses about what might happen next, and it's easy to get so sucked into the here and now and what may or may not happen in the next week or two,
Right.
that it makes it more challenging to take that big picture view of your life and why you're here and what matters most. And when I look back on this in a year from now, what do I want to remember about the way I showed up, the way I chose
Yeah.
to be here?
Yeah. What about for you personally? I know your personal life, from our offline conversations, you might be shifting priorities in response to everything that's going on, including kids being home from school, et cetera. So talk about that. What are you reprioritizing right now?
Well, for me, I mean, one thing I'm learning, and I think many others are as well, is to focus on the essentials, to not build, not schedule too many things or hold high expectations for productivity and output. Not that those things aren't important, but rather to be more clear and to take the time and space of maybe doing nothing or reflecting or planning or getting centered in order to be clear on what is really essential, what really matters most. And then focus, the time there. I'm doing something I don't usually do, which is I'm leaving gaps on my calendar. I'm usually very structured in terms of knowing exactly what I'm going to do at every hour of the day. And I'm realizing that just doesn't work right now, that I don't have that type of control or predictability.
Right.
And instead, I want to be clear. I try to stay clear on what's really important in terms of, my family life, my personal wellness, um, and other things. So not that I'm ignoring work or something like that, but I'm realizing I just can't do everything I used to be able to.
Right. And so I'm hearing adaptability, agility, like flexibility, and leaving, as you said, some time on your calendar for stuff that's going to come up that you wouldn't normally be, I don't want to say distracted by, but by being having to address, like, kids being home from school and things happen around that. And so yeah, I think flexibility is key. And I know for me, I can go too far on the free form side, like give myself too much freedom in situations like this. And I try to create, for me, like enough structure, but not too much structure, because too much structure doesn't give me the flexibility, but too little structure allows me to, maybe spend even more time watching the news or whatever. Otherwise, I might overindulge in certain things. And I think it's very important for all of us, and myself for sure, like really let in what's happening and process it, but also be productive, because productivity is a way of, in my mind, it's a form of self-care potentially. We can actually, if we focus on what we can control, then focus on getting some stuff done in ways that make sense right now, given the uncertainty in the world. But my focus has been on like really trying to stay conscious and mindful of where I spend my time and not be too distracted. And so it's a balancing act of structure versus non-structure, depending on who we are.
Right, right. And I think productivity has different ways to sort of interpret what that means, and it means different things to different people. And for some people, it's like just getting more things done, like more output in less time, sort of a
Yeah.
simple ratio there. And I think what's really coming out for me and others coming up is that it's really more about it's more of a value equation. Like, am I really doing the most valuable things? And if I am, what things can just not be done now in
Right.
order to make sure that I'm not just working down my to-do list, but rather doing what matters most.
I think this is an opportunity, and it's kind of confronting many of us with this challenge of like what's really truly essential versus nice to have, and focus as much as we can on the essential and let the nice to have stuff, set it aside for some time, and maybe it becomes less urgent over time. But just focusing on what we actually have to do or what's most important to us. And I like where you're kind of pointing, at least what I'm taking away from what you're saying, is that in my view, it's time to redefine what productivity means. In the business context, we define it relatively narrowly, in my view. It's about output, essentially, as you said. And that's an important metric to pay attention to. I don't want to dismiss that, but also productivity can be about, in this given moment, letting myself feel what I need to feel, for example. It's something that we don't, as leaders, as teams, as organizations, focus enough on, because that emotional intelligence piece and allowing ourselves to experience what we need to experience is actually really important, and is a form of productivity. So if it's a minute or 5 minutes or an hour, in some cases might even need a day or longer to kind of process stuff, given how much is going on right now. Not overindulge in that, but not ignore it either. That's, in my view, like, let's redefine what productivity actually means to include much more broader skills and places to focus.
Absolutely. And I think everyone would do well to really discover and create for themselves what that looks like. Because for some people, it might just be, 30 minutes of silence and just thinking. For some people, it might be a little bit more structured and like reflecting on what matters now and translating that into what do I want to do and how do I want to be, or something that's a little more linear. I think a lot of people struggle with just creating the time, and they tell themselves, and I mean, one trend always in leadership and executive coaching is seeing leaders that don't create enough time for planning, for reflection, for
Yeah.
self-awareness and that sort of thing. And because they're so busy doing and running from meeting to meeting, and really now is the time not to get, because of the anxiety, people sometimes tend to just get busier and busier to do more and do more. And it's really the opposite of what
Right.
we need right now.
I think even under normal circumstances, as you're saying, leaders and teams really struggle with that, like carving out enough time for the strategic thinking, to just process, to brainstorm, to think about the bigger picture and really prioritize, again, what's essential versus what's nice to have. It's so easy, even in under normal circumstances, to just kind of react and be, as you said, from meeting to meeting to meeting. And we might have that same MO, show up for us now in times of stress, whatever our reactive tendencies might be, that tend to come on even stronger. But now I think is especially a great time to like reset that and take a step back and ask ourselves again, what's truly important here? What are my values? What do I stand for as a leader? And how do I map what I do day to day into that, and make sure we're taking that reflection time? I think it's an opportunity in many ways, forced upon us. It might feel like it's forced upon us, but it's an opportunity to, again, reset and recalibrate how we spend our time.
Right. Yeah, and the restrictions that have been placed upon us, voluntarily or by and directive,
Yeah,
have also really cut people off from some of the core needs that they have. And we vary a lot from person to person. Some people have need for social engagement that they're not getting met right now, and might not feel like they have permission to or the means to. And those are things for people, I think, to really step back and become aware of, because there are serious potential consequences for our individual and collective well-being by
yeah.
not understanding our needs and doing what it takes to get those met.
Yeah, I mean, social isolation, the longer it goes on, the more marked the consequences are likely to become. And everybody has their own kind of tendencies and style. I'm quite sure it's likely to be harder for a strong extrovert to be to feel good in this environment than an introvert, just as an example. Also, a lot of the focus, and this is true for my conversations too, but the media and et cetera, and people are talking a lot about this adjustment we're all making to those of us who have families and have school-aged kids, and how much we're having to adjust to that. That's a very valid thing to focus on. It's a very real thing. And I think the thing that's maybe not getting enough conversation, and just came to mind for me as we're talking about this, is what about the people who don't have families? What about the people who live alone and don't have a social circle within their home? I can imagine in that scenario that would be especially lonely and difficult for many people. And I think that hasn't yet seen a lot of attention.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it's very real. And there's also, we as humans have need for affection and for touch, and
Yeah,
things that even with Zoom and this great technology, those needs aren't going to be met the way they used to be for a period of time.
right. What's your take on that? There's a lot of different information out there, and I don't think anybody really knows with any true clarity, like what's the timing going to be before things kind of start returning back to normal. I have, trusted sources I turn to and looking at a lot of different places and trying to basically triangulate what I think is likely to happen as far as the timing goes, as to when we can likely start lifting some of these physical distancing requirements. But what's your take on that? What do you think the timing might be, and how do you think that might play out?
I think, there are a few drivers, and clearly the logical one that most people pay a lot of attention to is, the statistics around how many cases, what are the trends in terms of how many deaths and things like that. But from a human needs perspective, what I'm anticipating is that people will not be able to tolerate the current situation much longer. The impacts of the social impacts, the impacts on feelings of restricted freedom, of so I don't know. My guess is probably no more informed than anybody else's, but I really think that from a legal perspective, we're going to see, in the next 2 months, probably sometime in May, significant, I don't know what you would call it, like getting back to normal,
Yeah.
in essence, like looking for society to have some standards, but less legal restriction.
Yeah, I find it hard to predict too. My best guess is if we're doing it in a reasonably safe way, about 2 months from now, we can start lifting some restrictions in some areas. And we've had such a piecemeal response across the nation. We're much more united at this point than we were. But if you look back at the history of the last month, as we've responded to this regionally and statewide and in individual states, et cetera, it's been a relatively piecemeal response because there hasn't been a centralized approach from the US government. I think that's going to happen in reverse. As we come out of this, there will be a lot of different choices being made across different regions, different metropolitan areas, different states. And I think it'll look similar in that lack of union, if you will, about how to approach it. And I think if we're intelligent about that, that's fine, meaning that we are looking at the data and seeing the trends and seeing that it seems reasonably safe to start lifting some restrictions. We can do that in a relatively piecemeal fashion if we're intelligent about it. But I'll be watching that to try to make sure, as best as I can tell, that the way in which those decisions are being made, state by state, metropolitan area by metropolitan area, makes sense given the data in that area. One of my concerns would be that we come back too fast and then we see another big wave that maybe is even worse than the first. Is a possibility that could play out if we don't respond, appropriately. I'm also hopeful that this virus, we don't yet know, to my knowledge, but this virus hopefully will not do well in the summer months. If that's true, then we could see a significant respite, beginning in June and going through the summer, which will give us a break and buy us more time, and we can start lifting potentially more of these restrictions quicker that way, with less risk, and then give us more time to have more of a better response come in the fall and winter when it probably comes back, stronger again. One
Yeah,
thing
and
I was looking
there,
at in regard to that is if you look at the cases so far in the northern hemisphere versus the southern hemisphere, this could be for other reasons. I don't know if this is the cause or not, but the southern hemisphere right now is entering into their fall. They've been in their summer. The cases in the southern hemisphere are much, much lower than the northern hemisphere. So again, I don't know if there's a causal relationship there, but it's potentially confirming evidence that maybe this virus doesn't do well in the summer months.
right. And there are so many things to consider that so few models incorporate right now, such as um, how can we project or even measure on an ongoing basis the impacts of these restrictions in terms of suicide, increases in domestic abuse, violent crime,
Right.
um, the all substance abuse, alcohol poisoning. I mean, we're going to see all sorts of things that over time get worse, that are in some way exacerbated by these restrictions,
Right.
exacerbated by the increasing unemployment and business closures and all of these things that could be considered consequences of the virus. So how
Yeah,
do
and
you
we
balance that with, there's the lives, there's the, measurement of how many positive cases and how many deaths do we have, but how do you know what the trade-off is in terms of these other issues?
It's hard to measure, and any attempt at measuring, well, we can measure it over time and get some ideas in retrospect, but making decisions ahead of time, it's difficult to model and kind of know what all the variables are, and then you have to make assumptions about those variables to come up with a model. And so it's a very challenging set of decisions to make, for sure.
Yeah, the UN is now calling for nations to, whatever their plans are for these restrictions going forward, to have as part of that strategy considerations for things such as domestic abuse, which are already supposedly we're already seeing it, increase problems there.
Yeah. So on the analysis and modeling side, I've seen just a few things come out in the last couple of weeks. The New York Times just a couple of days ago published a summary of a study that had been done on the 1918 pandemic, and those cities that did have much more stringent and much more sooner in the process responses as far as physical distancing goes actually came out economically better than the ones who didn't. That's just interesting evidence that we have in support of that strategy. The Economist also, in their most recent article, had a magazine, I should say, had a set of articles around this and trying to, again, assess the trade-offs that we're talking about. And they did cite things like increases in domestic abuse, increases in suicides, and other things like that. The data that they had actually suggested in general that the opposite would happen. It was a very surprising thing to me to see, but the domestic abuse, we've seen evidence that it probably is going up. But suicide rates and other things like that were actually historically tend to go down rather than up. And I don't have a good explanation for that. But my point is, there's some efforts being made to kind of model this stuff and come up with some estimates of what's going to happen, what the trade-offs are. But it's all you know, even in spite of all the best minds looking at it, there's just so many variables. We don't know enough about all the different variables to really assess it well, I would say. We're just doing our best that we can, given what we know.
Right. And most of us on an individual level have very little influence over, what gets done from a policy standpoint.
Right.
And we have so much more influence and control over ourselves and our own
Yeah.
immediate environment and our ability to support others through this challenging time. That's
So what are you doing in terms of your environment and your immediate connections and everything? What are you focusing on?
Well, I mean, as you know, I have 4 children and a wife at home, and so I'm pretty focused on my own mindset and disposition towards them, so that I can be present and loving, and really um, make the most of this situation. Which is interesting because in some ways it's turned out to be a tremendous blessing. I've been more connected to my family in the
Yeah.
last month than I
Yeah.
think any time in recent history. And so for me, some of that is letting go of this story about how productive I need to be and doing all of these things at work, that those things will still be there in a few
Right.
months as things begin to normalize and I can just pick them back up. But right now, I need to take care of myself and the people that are within my reach.
Yeah. As I said before, it's an interesting opportunity to reset priorities, right? And it sounds like you're doing that, like, as I think many of us are. What are you struggling with right now? Like, what's hard in terms of adapting to the current environment for you?
Um, Well, I mean, as you and I have talked about before, from a business perspective, there's all sorts of uncertainty about the marketplace and how to respond strategically, not knowing really the same motivations that people had before, not there now. Sort of everybody's sort of in this same soup of like not knowing where they are or where they're going in some way. And so for me, I guess. The challenge is just has been like just accepting that that's okay,
Yeah.
and that it's okay to be here, that it's to keep a perspective, that it's temporary. um yeah, and then just not knowing, during the day I have to balance, like I go to work and then I go and I'm home and I'm at work and I'm at home, and it's like um
Right.
my poor wife is working from home now with an infant and a toddler and 2 other kids, and we're
Yeah.
schooling them. So I mean, just teaching one of my kids, that's 10 hours a week, that I doing something that I don't really know how to do well. And
Right.
so for me, it's really like managing myself, like, okay, this is actually what I want to be doing. Like, this is meaningful. This isn't a distraction. This isn't this is actually a high value activity. So really shifting that mindset to seeing, to feeling connected to the person, versus where I think I was a few weeks ago, more was like in a state of kind of agitation because I felt like I couldn't do what I wanted to do. And so I had to
Yeah.
change my disposition there.
A lot of rich stuff you just said. One thing I want to riff off of is like the power to choose. I mean, we are choosing how we behave every day, and it's easy. And there's definitely truth to the idea that this was forced upon us. None of us, intentionally created this scenario, but it is here, whether we like it or not. And we can have a choice about how we respond to it. We can view it as something that was forced upon us, and we're kind of have no choice but to adapt, versus choosing, okay, given this scenario, how do I want to adapt and what makes sense to me? What am I actually choosing to do versus being forced to do? Is a different mindset to take on it. It sounds like you're reprioritizing, and I think, as I was saying before, like, to me, I want to shift the definition of productivity. Productivity should include all these things you're talking about. That those are very productive things to focus on in so many ways, and look at it economically, even like your children getting better education in this time of challenge. That's going to pay off for them and for the family and for greater society over time, right? So it's actually an economic payoff. It's not just a social and family payoff. It is, in my view, sometimes too narrow of a definition when it comes to productivity in the business context.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, choosing behaviors is a big part of it. And then managing your mindset. And, as one of the biggest things that I've worked on and feel a lot better about it myself is my relationship to blame. Is, am I creating this toxic situation within myself where I'm blaming this country or this president or this person for my distress. But
Yeah.
instead taking responsibility for that, surrendering blame, which doesn't mean I don't, care about policies or things like that, or I'm not involved socially in those ways, but it does change my ability uh, to be somebody who is very intentional about how I'm showing up, how I'm experiencing life, and which is, it ties into social media again. I mean, I think we all see on social media there are a lot of people with strong opinions and really mad at at everybody or at certain people or
Right.
whatever, and blame just doesn't help us. It just takes us away from being able to really pivot to what matters most, to those activities, to those people.
Yeah, I'm glad you're saying that, because my experience is that blame is pretty insidious. In my own personal experience, it's a constant work in progress for me. But I look back over the last, up until the last 5 years or so, I think I had a tendency to blame much more than I even was aware of consciously, because it was a kind of a stance that I learned through whatever means to take on life. Like whatever happens is just not in my control. It's essentially where blame comes from. And blame can be a channel for anger. Like we get upset about whatever's happening and then we blame somebody else or some other circumstance or a set of people or COVID-19, for example. All this stuff is real. I don't want to say it's not, it's not real. Of course it's real. And we choose how we respond to that. We can either blame that and say, okay, I'm going to be angry at that. But how much does that really help us? What it really does is give us a means by which we can kind of be paralyzed and say, okay, it's out of my hands. It's someone else's fault or something else's fault. Therefore, I'm not going to take responsibility. And I know for me, kind of unpacking that tendency I had to be full of blame was a very difficult thing to do. And it took time, and it's still an unpacking I'm going through, but I'm much better today at not indulging in that, because as you said, it doesn't really help, but it's very common, I think. And it goes back to a victim mindset versus a co-creator mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Everything in life, in my belief system, is co-created. Like I have a role in everything that happens in my life, and I have agency in everything that happens in my life. That's a very different mental and mindset come from than the blame game. And the blame game, it pays off in terms of our ego, but it doesn't pay off in terms of serving us
Or others, right?
or
Because we
others.
can't, unless we take responsibility. And I think a good distinction is that comes to mind for me right now is there's blame and then there's attribution. And so it makes sense to connect the dots and say, okay, this is attributed to this. This is why this happened. That's making sense of the world around us. But then it becomes unhelpful blame when we're using it to abdicate our own responsibility,
Right,
and we're failing to see that we do have power to change our life situation and to
right.
positively impact other people despite what else might be happening that's outside of our control.
That's an important distinction, blame versus attribution, because I think some people, and I've been there myself, where we tend to collapse the two. Like if we let go of blame, then we're letting go of attribution. We maybe are letting go of asking other people to be responsible for their actions. That's not what I'm advocating for at all. But if you can attribute something to someone else's role or some set of people or COVID-19, whatever it might be, there's a balancing act there in terms of being responsible for yourself and also expecting others to be responsible for themselves. So it's not about letting people um, do things to you that you don't necessarily accept, or outside of your boundaries, or whatever the situation might be. It's about taking responsibility for how you respond to that and having agency in that situation and not seeing yourself as a victim. Um, what else is going on in your world?
Um, that's about it. It's funny you mentioned the introversion thing earlier, because for
Yeah,
me, it's not that hard for me to have less social engagement out in the world. But I am realizing there are one thing I do have a need for that's not being met well, and I need to take more responsibility for, is my physical fitness, my health, right? A lot of us are not getting the exercise we used to get, and we're not maybe eating as well as, and I'm one of those people. And so that's
yeah,
something I'm really wanting to take more responsibility for, because I used to go to the gym every morning and work out. I can't do that now. And so
right.
there's work to be done in terms of creating my own healthy habits. And the physical and the spiritual and the emotional, they're all intertwined. And if we don't care for our bodies well, then we can't care as well for others, or have the mindset and the impact that we want to have.
Yeah, say more about that, because I have a similar belief that, holistic view where physical, emotional, spiritual is all kind of blended together. But what does that look like for you?
Um, what does that look like for me? Well, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that wellness entails all of those things you just said: physical, spiritual, emotional, mental. Um, and I think the most like simple, concrete things we can do are physical, that really have to do with how we're treating our bodies. But we need to all be paying attention to all of those things. I'm probably not answering your question very well, but for me, I mean, what I've noticed is like right now in my life, I am creating the opportunities to create emotional awareness, to be deliberate about who I want to be and how I want to handle things and that sort of thing. But I've allowed myself to not hold myself responsible for probably, in my opinion, the most foundational, because if we don't take care of our body, we don't live,
Yeah,
we die.
yeah.
So that's, I don't know, that's just what's coming up for me in this moment.
Yeah, I know for myself, when I think about that, one thing that comes up is there was a time, I've been an avid mountain biker for years, like off and on, decades at this point. And there was a time in my early 30s when I was riding a lot and really over time got myself when probably was the best physical condition I've ever been in my adult life. And I still remember how good I felt overall. Just throughout the day, I was, more felt like I had more agency, more responsibility, more emotion, more emotional intelligence, and ability to navigate whatever's going on. And I remember thinking at some point in that period of time where it's like, wow, if I could just focus on this consistently throughout my life, everything would be so much better. And I haven't kept that up to the degree I was then, but I still remember that very vividly. And of course, everything's intertwined. I don't want to say that it's all about physical conditioning, but we do feel so much better when we're physically taking care of ourselves.
Yeah, and actually just reminded me, I think you used to be a motorcycle racer, is that
I
right?
was, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that's another thing I think a lot of us aren't getting, is that we have activities in our normal life that give us exhilaration or flow, where we have a sense of mastery and time just zips by,
Yeah.
and it's so rejuvenating in almost an unconscious way. And those are largely physical activities that we're mostly deprived of at this point in time.
Yeah, as you're saying that, I miss that exhilaration. And what I do these days, it's similar to that, as I go out on the racetrack with my car and drive, and I coach other drivers how to be better on the high-speed drivers, essentially. But of course, that's off the table right now because of the physical distancing going on, and that's a loss that I'm really feeling. As you're pointing to, like any kind of physical activity, it's hard to get that exhilaration and that thrill, and as well as the just a physical, being in my body experience. I'm not getting as much of that as I really crave and usually can have relatively easily.
Hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of talk about emotional intelligence, and there's been a lot of talk historically about IQ and intellectualism, and um, very little discussion about physical intelligence. And so it's not just about like our cholesterol level and our BMI and that sort of thing, but it's also about how are we really fully engaging our bodies in our life, and what's missing now that was once there, that maybe we can get back. Maybe we just need to be creative and mindful about it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I never thought of it that way until you just said it. But physical. We talk about intellectual intelligence. That's been a well-established topic for decades now. Emotional intelligence has risen to prominence in the last 15, 20 years as a common thing that many of us think about. And when it comes to our physical bodies, we definitely think about that, but we don't define it as being a form of intelligence. We think of it in a kind of a clinical way. We look at stats like cholesterol, body mass index, how we look in the mirror, things like that. But the intelligence part of it is like it serves us in so many ways. And I think we don't treat it holistically. It's like this compartmentalized thing, at least in the Western world. I think we would all benefit from taking a more holistic approach and really thinking of that not just as taking care of ourselves physically, but emotionally and spiritually, and every level goes up when we're taking better care of ourselves physically.
Mm-hmm.
What are you what are you taking away from this conversation so far?
Well, now that I've expressed it to the listeners, I'm now going to hold myself accountable for
Right.
putting more time and attention on this. Getting my physical wellness in place. And what else am I taking away? Yeah, I think just the sort of a commitment to make a difference in the world in this way, because as I was saying at the beginning, it's really just become a lot more clear to me that what people need from me as a coach, as a friend, or whatever, is is to help them attune to these things that we've been talking about, is to help them look within themselves, step back, re-examine their habits, and as you said, co-create from a new place, given the
Yeah.
new reality or the current reality. And yeah, that's the main thing I'm taking away is actually a desire to do that, right? Because
Yeah.
I think some of us right now could feel like the world's kind of closing in on us, and it can sort of limit our ability to really even think about serving others, right?
Yes.
And that's so that's something else that's coming up for me is like a real heartfelt desire to have a broader impact, to help people with these very things.
And as you said, make a difference in the world. Yeah, I think we all can benefit from looking to that. And it's so easy in times of stress, emotionally, psychologically, and physiologically. Like we tend to go inward and kind of self-preserve to some extent in that fight, flight, or freeze response. And more consciously we can choose to, okay, I want to respond in a way where I focus on what's important to me. And I think for many of us at some level, it's about making our dent in the world. That's a good takeaway from this conversation. I'm also taking away just more of a holistic approach to everything and really, internalizing that on another level. And we touched on, the blame game and taking responsibility and looking at things as being co-created versus, someone else's fault or circumstances fault. So I'm taking that away to like a deeper, sense of that as well. Any final words you want to say before we sign off?
Yeah, just one thought on this whole notion of making a difference in the world is that I think there are a lot of counterfeits for that. Like someone, we might be tempted to think, well, if I post this on Facebook and 600 people see it and they share it, then I'm making a difference in the world.
Yeah.
I would say probably not. I would say, sort of counterintuitively, probably the biggest impact you can have on the world is on a very um, potentially a one-on-one basis, right?
Yeah.
Reach out to somebody who does, like you said, some people don't have anybody else in their home. All
Right.
of us probably know somebody like that. There's probably no chance that you could reach out too much or offer too
Right.
much support to those
Right.
people.
Right.
And just a 5-minute phone call or even a text message to that one person could make a bigger difference in the world than 100 different Facebook posts.
Yeah. Thanks for that. That's beautiful. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Thanks for this opportunity, Daniel.
Yeah. And if people want to learn more about you, where can they find you?
Well, my website is scalingleaders.com.
Okay. Good. Thanks again for being here. Appreciate the conversation, and I'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Thanks. Take care.
You too.